Hello, hello. Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sydney Yeager. I'm the Senior Public Programs Producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Thank you so much for joining us today in person and both online for our event with our very esteemed panel, who you will get to meet shortly. I do just want to take this time to ask you, if you are here in person, to turn off your cell phone or anything that will make noise during the program. We will have time for Q&A at the end, so you should have received a flashcard and a pencil, so feel free to write down any questions, and if you didn't get one, flag us down and we will hand you one, and we will collect those near the end for Q&A. I also want to say thank you so much for coming to the museum. If you didn't have the chance today, or if you don't have the chance after the panel is over, we hope that you will come back and see our many exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, which is the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up, and also our newest exhibition, Speaking Up, which opened very recently. So we hope that if you hadn't had the chance to see those yet, that you will be able to see those. So now I am going to hand things over to our panel. I know you don't want to hear me talk very much, so thank you so much for being here.
Hello, everybody, or as we say in Australia, g'day. Hope you're all well. I bring greetings from down under. My name is Dr. Kirill Shields, and I'm the organizer of today's event. And I just want to begin, before passing today's forum over to our chair, to Dr. Daniel Levy, just to provide a little bit of context to then also provide some thank yous and to give an overview of how we're going to run the forum today. I think the topic today is extremely important and also very topical. And as a part of this context that I wish to give, I should just say, I'll forecast sort of suggest this from the very start, that this, I don't know what you call it, is a disclaimer, I suppose. I speak on behalf of myself and on behalf of my institution or the center. So everything I say and all the mistakes I make are purely mine. And so with that disclaimer out of the way, because in what I talk about a little bit later, you'll sort of see why I'm disclaiming one or two things. What I do wish to do, though, is to set up where this came from. And about a year ago, a group of Holocaust literature scholars, not many, some of you who are here today, met at the Ray Walpole Institute for the study of Holocaust, genocide, and crimes against humanity at Western Washington University to discuss chapters that we're contributing to, which is a new book on Holocaust literature, which has been organized and edited by Professors Erin McLaughlin and Stuart Taberner. And at that meeting, at the time, we came up with, as a group, kind of an idea that we would be in New York in a year's time, and here we are. 1 year has gone by very quickly, which is what happens when you're in your 50s. And we would be here to discuss, again, Holocaust literature, and we thought, what a great opportunity. Similarly, I realized at the same time that the UN will be holding its Summit of the Future, shortly followed by then the General Assembly meeting. And I thought, what a great time and perfect opportunity to meld the work of literary theory and the world of humanitarianism and the world of the humanitarian practitioner. So here we are today with a forum titled, Does Reading Holocaust Literature Strengthen Human Rights? And that's at the core of the discussion today, and from various angles and from various perspectives, from both those who work in the literary world and those who work as human rights practitioners. It gives us opportunity as friends and colleagues from both of these sectors to reflect on the important corpus of literary work that is Holocaust literature and its application to, as we will no doubt, I suspect we will hear about, given the UN's Under-Secretary General and Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide is here amongst us and as one of our participants. What does it do in the work of human rights practitioners, especially around the prevention of mass atrocity crimes? Before I introduce today's chair, I wish to say a few thanks as well as part of that context. Firstly, I really wish to thank the Museum of Jewish Heritage many years ago, and that was many, many years ago now, and I think I was counting it, maybe it was 20 years ago now, unfortunately, I was very fortunate to have been awarded an Auschwitz Jewish Center Fellowship, and it started here in New York, and I spent 2 days in this museum before we all went and spent time in Poland. And here I am many years later, again, part of this great institution. When I was looking for somewhere to host this event, I emailed and said, hey, I'm a fellow from years back. You may not remember me. In fact, they didn't remember me. But is it possible to host this event there? And they were so great. Thank you very much. I see the president up the back there. Thank you so very much. Immediately, they wrote back and said, yes, we will like to host it. So thank you so very much. And in particular, I'd also like to thank Sydney Yeager for all her work as well. But I'd also like to thank all of today's participants, because I know that we're all very busy, especially the special advisor who's come straight from the Summit of the Future, and I think you need to go back to the Summit of the Future straight after this. But also other participants who are here who have spent time in New York, and not only am I taking them away from work and from their flights, I know Zoe has to fly out soon after this, but also I've taken them away from the opportunity to walk the streets of New York. So what we're going to do today, we're going to have a brief, I'm going to introduce the chair in a second, and from there we'll have 5 to 6 minutes each as panelists to talk. Then we will have a roundtable discussion amongst ourselves, and then we're going to open it up to both you here in the forum, but to our online audience as well. And I know we have a considerable number of you Zooming in or something akin to that out there in the virtual world. So hello to all of you as well. And without further ado then, let me pass the microphone over to the chair, Professor Daniel Levy. And Daniel Levy is Professor of Sociology at Stony Brook University, so not too far from here. He is a political and historical sociologist with a focus on memory studies, and his long-standing engagement with memory studies dates back, you're going to say dates back to the 1990s, but I don't think the 1990s was too far back, back to the 1990s. And in 2001, he published The Holocaust and Memory in the Global Age, which is something that speaks to the topic today. And then in 2010, he published Memory and Human Rights. So Daniel himself has also a position to take up on this topic. And then he's also co-editor of the Collective Memory Reader, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2011. And he's currently working on a monograph about solidarity in the global age, if there is such a thing. Great. Thank you, Daniel. Daniel, over to you.
But what I thought I'd do, I have only 5 minutes, which is for an academic a real problem, so I had to write out these things because otherwise I would digress and we would never get on with the program. So what I want to do is I want to give you schematically a sense of how the nexus of Holocaust memory and human rights have evolved over the last 8 decades. Actually not 8, but we'll get to that. So for practical purposes, I'd like to divide the emergence, consolidation, and contestation of the Holocaust human rights nexus into 3 broad periods. And for the sake of our discussion, I suggest that these 3 periods correspond, not exactly of course, to what I would refer to as modular, bridging, and contested stages related to the Holocaust memory human rights connection. Let me just preface that Holocaust literature already emerges shortly after World War II with quite a lot of publications and translations in the 1950s and 1960s. However, the overt connection between the Holocaust and human rights took 23, or I would say 30 plus years to emerge. So the first period that I dated is the late 70s with 2 important events. One is the Helsinki Accords, which brought human rights to global attention and helped fortify existing human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and helped the formation of others, to name but a few. And the other event is the fictionalized TV series, Holocaust, from the late 70s. I'm mentioning the TV series to underscore the importance of cultural production, primarily through popular culture, and as we will hear shortly, also in the realm of literature. The second period starts during the 1990s. For one, the Balkan Wars was the first major war on European territory after the Holocaust. And it started with the failure of the West to stop atrocities at a time when the significance of the witness accounts and the critique of bystanderdom were part of public discourse. At this point, never again was a recognized trope, and the failure to prevent Serbian massacres was unacceptable. And if you want for a more direct link, one need only think of Roy Goodman's photograph from an emaciated inmate at a Serbian concentration camp, resonating with a Holocaust iconography that would connect the neologism, of ethnic cleansing with the Holocaust. In 1993, the second set of major events putting Holocaust memory and human rights front and center was the success of Schindler's List and, of course, the foundation of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Here we can see a massive effort to universalize the message and lessons learned from the Holocaust. Lessons to be learned about political violence and state-sponsored mass atrocities. During the 1990s, which I consider to be the heyday of the human rights regime, lasting roughly until 9/11, the commemoration of the Holocaust became a warning against human rights abuses and was inscribed in various laws and also commanding commemorative imperatives. With the designation of January 27th as International Holocaust Remembrance Day by the United Nations in 2005, I would say we have reached the apex of the Holocaust human rights connection. The third period, for the sake of simplicity, starts in the new millennium. Modeling and bridging continues to this day. One need only to think about the proliferation of Holocaust memorials in far-flung places that really have a connection to the event. It's quite remarkable. However, Holocaust memory as such has become a contested concept around questions and disputes about competing victimhood, that is to say hierarchies of victims, public, not so much historiographical debates about questions of singularity, that is to say, was the Holocaust unique? And these debates led, among other things, to Eastern European demands for the recognition of Stalinism. And since the 2010s, driven by post-colonialism, we have voices that not only want recognition of colonial crimes, which are slowly but surely forthcoming, but also criticize the dominance of Holocaust memory, performing some kind of screen memory, relegating other mass atrocities to the margin. And you don't have to be an expert to recognize that October 7 and the ongoing war constitute another turning point, marking struggles between those who want to defend the privileged position of the Holocaust and those who see it as a justification or an excuse for political expediencies. In conclusion, designating a historical event like the Holocaust as the first global memory raises a host of challenging questions. Global according to whom? Where and what for? The first three aspects of this question seem to enjoy some agreement, at least on the descriptive level. The commemoration of the Holocaust has received a level of recognition and institutionalization that commands global attention. The what for, however, has become a source of tension, resulting in numerous academic, public, and political debates. Thank you. Now, let me now introduce our first speaker. It is an honor to introduce Alice Vairumu Deritu, a United States Undersecretary General and Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. Ms. Deritu is a recognized voice in the field of peace building and atrocity crimes prevention. As mediator of armed conflicts, she served as a member of the African Union's network of African women in conflict, prevention, and mediation, the Women Waging Peace Work Network, and Global Alliance of Women Mediators. She contributed to defining the role of women mediators as one of the few women who are signatories to peace agreements as a mediator. She's an Aspen Leadership Scholarship recipient, a Transitional Justice Fellow, Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in South Africa, and a Global Raphael Lemkin Course alum. She also served as summer course faculty at SIT Graduate School in Vermont and lecturer for the Socioeconomic Rights course at Pretoria University Center for Human Rights in South Africa. She was a facilitator of the Senior Mission Leaders course at the International Peace Support Training Center, Kenya, and the Rwanda Military Academy, also in Rwanda. I pass it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I must say it's such an honor to be here having this conversation among friends and on a topic that is so relevant but also so interesting, on Holocaust literature, strengthening human rights. And I say so because I have been both a student of literature and of history. And so I found the topic like very useful in terms of even looking back from a personal perspective on what I do know about the Holocaust from a human rights perspective. And so I thought about all these years that I've been working on human rights, how we often relied on the human rights principles of interdependence, inalienability, I can never pronounce that word, accountability, participation, empowerment, non-discrimination, and what then that means when you are thinking practically about Holocaust literature. And so we always go back. I think it's important to go back in time, thinking about Raphael Lemkin, this Polish Jewish lawyer who came up with the name genocide by combining, taking our Latin Greek words, geno and side, and then creating this word genocide, but also going back to what informed his thinking that this crime needed a name, this crime where you could kill large identities of people and get away with it because this crime had no name. And thinking about himself as a young child, reading Henry Skerswitz's book, Quo Vadis. Henry was Nobel laureate, and gathering from that book this knowledge that there were groups of people who could be killed and people could get away with it. He was thinking about the Carthaginians, he was thinking about the Huguenots, he was also then later, of course, thinking about the Armenians, and he had all these questions in his mind in terms of what then does it mean that entire groups of people can be killed. And of course, he was also informed by the fact that he was Jewish and he knew about the Jewish pogroms that had taken place for more than 2,000 years against the Jewish people. And so the question he asks of his mother, when he tells his mother, when she's reading to him about Emperor Nero killing Christians, but mother, why didn't anybody call the police? And the realization that comes to him as a small child that even if anyone had called the police would not have come, because it was accepted that you could kill people on the basis of identity. Yet you could not even have a relationship with a murderer of one person, but people could be killed on the basis of identity. So then thinking about the enormous amount of reading that Raphael Lemkin read to come up with this word, genocide, as a prosecutor and also as a lecturer as he taught. And looking at all this reading, at a time when reading was so crucial and so important that actually the Nazi government thought that one of the most symbolic things they could do was ban books publicly, books especially written by Jewish people. So then you see how all this informed the world's first human rights convention, which was the 1948 Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, a convention that was informed by the horrors of the Holocaust, of what had happened, and of this never again call. So then I think about when did I begin to learn of the Holocaust? I'm always talking about hearing it first from my grandfather, who fought in both world wars. And when I was a small girl, I asked him what is the worst possible thing he saw during the war. He said, I didn't see it, but I heard that they were cooking people in ovens, that they made ovens to cook people. And so that became for me a fascination with the Holocaust. And so books, from my perspective growing up in Kenya, I don't quite remember the first book I read. I read the books that children read here, Elie Wiesel's Night, Anne Frank. I read all that as an adult. But as a child, I think what influenced us more, or the knowledge of the Holocaust, was brought to us as young Kenyan Africans through film. And this was long before Schindler's List, when this, like Schindler's List, made the Holocaust so real and was watched so globally. But there was a film called Escape from Sobibor, and it was going around. We had what we call factual film, mobile cinema, that would go from village to village. And I remember watching that film, Escape from Sobibor, and seeing the horrors of the Holocaust for the first time. And so then, of course, after that, when we get into school, then we are reading about the Holocaust, but not from a human rights perspective. We were reading it as part of history. I was fascinated with history. And then, of course, later on, in the kind of work that I began to do in human rights and continue to do now, so much of the books that we've seen that speak to the Holocaust and human rights have been informed by the trials, especially the Nuremberg trials. We saw how the Nuremberg trials informed both the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and the references, and especially to the history of atrocity crimes, the history of war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity. This wonderful book by Philip Sands, East-West Street, that speaks to the origin of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And so, again, we saw, because trials are very powerful in terms of teaching. So Hannah Arendt's, the Eichmann trial, Deborah Lipstad's too, the Eichmann trial, like all this coverage of the Eichmann trial, those books, how rich they made our reading and our connection of human rights, of seeing actually human rights violations, that what happened to the Holocaust were actually human rights violations, and that they were not just history, and that they could happen, and even beginning to get to the realization that they could actually be applied in other contexts. This focus on identities and killing people on the basis of identity. And then, of course, the contribution of the prosecutors has been invaluable in linking human rights to the Holocaust. Thomas Dodd, Ben Ferencz, Raphael Lemkin himself was a prosecutor. Their books, wonderful, wonderful books. And then now, when I look at books right now, I'm still thinking that we haven't done enough to link the Holocaust to human rights, that we still see the Holocaust as history, and then that informs the thinking that it happened in history, and therefore, or it only happens to some people, because that's part of the pushback that we get when you're talking about the Holocaust or genocide in places where it hasn't happened. People say, oh, you know, but that happened to the Tutsi, it happened to the Bosniak Muslims in Srebrenica, it happened to the Jewish people, but what does it have to do with us? So that disconnect of people not understanding that those very clear human rights violations that happened to these people, these identity groups that were targeted for extinction, could happen to them, then speaks to the fact of people seeing this as history, but not as current human rights issues. And I would recommend this book with this with a very, it has a title that when you first see it, you kind of get put off, but when you read it, it's a really wonderful book. And it speaks to what we are discussing today, and also the angle that I've approached it in terms of the Holocaust being seen more as history than human rights. And the book is called People Love Dead Jews. And it's by Dara Horn. And I'm glad I read the book, and I was privileged to be able to get in touch with her. And she's saying exactly what I'm saying. She's saying people are so fascinated by the history of dead Jewish people. They pay homage to dead Jewish people. They'll go to museums, but when it comes to dealing with the live Jewish people who are undergoing anti-Semitism and all these kinds of violations, that then people do not make that connection, that the only reason it's possible for that to happen is because these violations happened in the first place. So, speaking also as Timothy Snyder's Black Earth, The Holocaust as History, again, another very good book that connects the past and the present. And when I was thinking about this, I also thought I thought to myself, since I think it was in 2016, when Bob Dylan, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for literature. And of course, there was some controversy from people in the literary world. But I thought to myself that it would be great to have a conversation, actually, about music and the Holocaust. What kind of music speaks to the Holocaust? Songs, we don't forget. They bind us. We sing songs by Bob Marley, all of us. Somebody would know even one sentence. So where are these songs by the Holocaust, on the Holocaust? So then we are in that space, I believe, like the lessons I took from all this. Considering that my mandate, part of it is to collect existing information on massive and serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, of ethnic and racial origin that, if not prevented or halted, could lead to genocide. And considering the anti-Semitism that we have seen since October 7th especially, I began to ask myself, who are the sources of public knowledge on the Holocaust? How do we diversify the sources of public knowledge on the Holocaust? Because I started thinking in terms of my office, we have prioritized in our office Holocaust and genocide denial as a key human rights issue. We partnered with the Jacob Blaustein Institute, and we produced a policy document on Holocaust and genocide denial as a human rights violation. And so I found this great sentence from Timothy Snyder's book, that the precise combination of ideology and circumstance of the year 1941 will not appear again, but something like it might. So when he wrote that, I'm sure he wasn't seeing what's going on right now. So I do believe that, as I conclude, that we are producing knowledge on the Holocaust, like, for example, that policy that I just mentioned. But I'm not sure we are doing enough to influence the direction that it takes in regards especially to diversifying audiences. And that unless we take preventive measures, that the ideas that no longer have the appeal of novelty, when you think about the authors of these books on the Holocaust, people who survived the Holocaust, people like Elie Wiesel, when you think about them dying, then we should begin thinking, what do we do when the idea of the Holocaust no longer has novelty, when we have a whole generation that says that is really history. We don't even know anyone alive who can testify that that actually happened. And then thinking about the first time I saw somebody with a tattoo from Auschwitz, it was at the Holocaust Museum in Canada, in Montreal, and I remember like seeing it. There's something completely different about seeing it than seeing a description that numbers were actually tattooed on people. And so to see it in the flesh is really something else. So thinking about, with so many Holocaust survivors leaving us, how do we ensure that ideas that are more or less essential to our understanding and a vital part of our traditions do not drift to the blink of oblivion, do not become lesser than human rights issues? How do we ensure that current human rights issues as we know them right now, human rights issues that are informed by circumstances that were not there before, informed by social media, informed by climate change issues, informed by things we never imagined, informed by technology in ways we never imagined, how do we ensure that then we keep this tradition going on, but also that we can pick, even in small bits of animation that we can share in these WhatsApp groups and the places where people are having conversation. How do we take the key ideas, for example, of Raphael Lemkin and put them in that space so that then we have a conversation about the Holocaust and human rights in which people can clearly identify that these are human rights violations, and the human rights violations are the causes and consequences of the Holocaust, and that they are real, and that they can happen to anybody in the world, and that the Holocaust is a human rights lesson that has to keep being taught. So I think for me, those were the key issues that I was were going through my mind. And again, very, very happy to be engaging on this topic. Thank you.
Can you all hear me? Yeah, now it's working, I'm sorry. Before I introduce our next speaker, I want to make a disclaimer. I'm not playing with my phone, and when it goes off, it's the timer that goes after 6 minutes, so please bear with me, and you can tell I'm a terrible timekeeper. But now, no, that's okay. Now it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Zoe Norwich, who is a reader in African and Comparative Literature and Visual Cultures at King's College London. Dr. Norwich researches contemporary arts in Rwanda and cultural responses to the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. Her work often involves collaborations with artists and survivors, and she has convened numerous workshops, events, and exhibitions of photography in Rwanda and the UK. Her translation of Yolanda Mukasagana's survivor testimony, Not My Time to Die, was published by Husa Press in 2019. She has also made 2 BBC radio documentaries, Rwanda's Returnees and Living with Memory in Rwanda. She's former chair of the Ishami Foundation and an associate editor of Wazafiri magazine, and a member of the UK Holocaust Memorial Day Trust's expert reference group. She edited a special issue of Wazafiri on human rights cultures in Rwanda, Kenya, Colombia, and Argentina with the Kenyan writer Billy Kahora. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Special Advisor. It's an honor to be speaking after you. So today I'm going to talk about how Holocaust literature helps us to glimpse the depth of wounding relating to genocide. And then I'm going to ask some questions about whether or not that supports human rights. So, depth of wounding. Charlotte Delbo, in the first book of her Auschwitz trilogy, Aucun de nous ne reviendra, so None of Us Will Return, talks about how life changed fundamentally. She says there is no after the Holocaust. Camp experiences stretched into the past. They changed the memories she had of what had happened in her childhood, the memories she had of things that had happened before she reached the camp. And it also seeped into the present. It rewrote all of her experiences afterwards, giving her the feeling that she never actually fully left the camps. Yafra Layach, Eva Hoffman, and many other Yiddish writers that you here in the audience may know much better than me talk about how whole communities in Eastern Europe were destroyed forever, and about the few people who survived from those communities can never return because those places, those people no longer exist. In Rwanda, the child survivor of genocide, Berkay Itezi, talks about how life afterwards is too full of memory. And Rwandan survivor testimony often speaks about this idea that life is divided into before and after the genocide, and the afterwards is fundamentally determined by the event. Rwanda's homes, roads, churches, schools, hospitals where killings took place cannot go back to how they were before. They are, in the memories of people living today, still written through with the genocide. Literature then shows us how survivors have to live with the memory of those who died and the knowledge that such loss is possible, remains possible. Survivors live with the loss of their children, and they live with the impossibility of unknowing this loss as they build their new families. Now, how does this help with human rights? Well, literature, I believe, gives us a form of felt knowledge, which is very different to factual knowledge. It helps us to glimpse, to touch at a distance, the kind of precarity that survivors feel, the kind of agony that they still experience, the ongoing nature of genocide well after it ends. Paying attention to this may help us to understand the urgency of the sense of threat experienced by post-genocide populations. So, for example, if we think about the case of Rwanda, if the international community had been paying attention, if they had been learning from the depth of this wounding that we see in Holocaust literature, they might have understood that in the immediate aftermath of that genocide, when people who had been involved in perpetrating genocide were regrouping alongside civilians, but we were regrouping in those camps on the border in Congo, they might have understood that that was a completely untenable situation for the Rwandans in Rwanda, for the Rwandan survivors, for the Rwandan returnees, that it was impossible to live with that possibility of genocide coming back, of genocide returning. And the international community could have intervened much earlier and lives would have been saved rather than leaving it for the Rwandan government to take action. So glimpsing the depth of this wounding also helps us to understand why, when President Kagame says, as he does again and again, I will not let this happen again, When he says that, it resonates viscerally in Rwanda with so many people. Freedom from fear is a crucial human right after genocide. However, the counter-argument to this is that the highly emotive material relating to genocide might obscure the human rights of other populations. And this is an argument that is raised again and again by critics of the current government in Rwanda, and it's something that very much polarizes the field of Rwanda studies within which I work. So critics of the Rwandan government argue that stories of victimhood are instrumentalized to hide other human rights abuses. My question is, how do we grapple with this as people who care very, very deeply about stories? And the answer I want to suggest very tentatively today is that perhaps what we need to do then is return to the literature. The wider national story is often not the same as the much more personal, intimate story we find in literary testimony. So Holocaust literature depicts a multifaceted, intricate human world, a world with moments of personal encounters despite political division and sometimes across political division. A world with all the ambiguities and unpredictabilities of human nature, a very particular world lived by individuals in community at particular moments, in particular places and times. Similarly, Rwandan literature is very complex and very varied. So Yolande Mukagasana, in her book, which was the first to be published after the genocide, La mort ne veut pas de moi, or it was translated, I translated it into English as Not My Time to Die. There, she reflects on the reasons for genocide. She reflects on her role in the reasons for genocide. She has very complex feelings about the people who help her. She has very complex feelings about perpetrators. Sometimes she pities them. Sometimes she feels a strange sense of love for them. Really bizarre, difficult feelings, but these are human beings she's writing about in all of their nuance. Gaël Faye, in his novel, Petit Pays, translated as Small Country, depicts a child, an exiled Rwandan child, who's growing up in Burundi, and the relationships he has with domestic staff from a whole range of ethnicities. And because it's such a naive child's perspective there, we get a sense of how each person comes with their own world, comes with their own priorities, with their own concerns. Jo Ingabire Moyes, who's another child survivor of genocide, now an adult and a very accomplished filmmaker and writer, I'm working with her, supporting a project she is doing called 100 Stories for 100 Days. And that brings together 100 Rwandan voices to talk about what happened in 1994. And I can tell you that that is not a single narrative. Those 100 voices are all talking from different places, and they're all talking about other human beings with all the complexity that that involves. So for me then, the writing of genocide at its best opens up a space for bringing together multiple individual stories of loss that reflect existing or lost communities and have the potential, and this is important, have the potential to form new communities. So for me, teaching Holocaust literature alongside Rwandan literature has never felt more relevant, because it helps us to glimpse the long-lasting nature of wounding after genocide, but also because survivor voices like Primo Levi urge us to again be vigilant, to take action to prevent human suffering. And by bringing together disparate experiences of suffering through individually crafted narratives, for me, remains an essential dream and an essential part in holding different stories of pain and different stories of suffering in dialogue and together. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Savita Pandey. She is the Executive Director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, established in 2008 with the support of international human rights leaders, including former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, as well as supportive governments and organizations such as Human Rights Watch and International Crisis Group. The Global Center is the world's leading research and advocacy organization for advancing the international law of the responsibility to protect, also known as R2P, at the United Nations and beyond. Savita has led Global Center's work on UN peacekeeping, international justice mechanisms, women, peace and security, and advocacy on specific country situations where populations are at risk of atrocities, such as Syria, Myanmar, South Sudan, Yemen, and Ethiopia, to name but a few. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that I'm holding the mic, right? Thank you so much, and a big thanks to the Museum of Jewish Heritage for hosting this conversation, and also to our dear colleague and friend, Carol Shields, for bringing us all together for this really important discussion. I think that for practitioners like Alice and I, sometimes these are sort of a moment to just take a step back and reflect on where we are coming from and where we are going, and how the literature and the experiences inform the everyday work that we can do and how we can do it better. So, as you can understand from that introduction, I lead an organization. I come from a practitioner's perspective, unlike the other colleagues on the panel. And my organization does research and multilateral advocacy to generate action to protect populations from genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And we sort of base our work on the political commitment that was made by heads of states in 2005, 150 heads of states in 2005, on not being a bystander. So the idea and the norm of responsibility to protect emerged. It was an addition, a political addition to the already existing commitments that governments already have been obligated to, but then didn't take action on Rwanda, Bosnia, which they should have done under the Genocide Convention. So R2P, a political commitment, is about engendering action when governments are failing to prevent and respond to atrocity crimes. It's about preventing it, but it's also about stepping in when government is unable or unwilling. So in that context, and I mean in multiple, both Alice and Zoe and David also talked about sort of, you know, how Rwanda and Srebrenica and all of these different atrocities have sort of but have consistently evoked the never again commitment that was made in the aftermath of Holocaust, but also these are the crises which sort of took us back to the iconography which emerged from the Holocaust and sort of, you know, provided us that this is also happening in the present. Now, but what I'm talking about is 30 years ago. But you know, there's a huge impact of how we study Holocaust, how we looked at the Holocaust, on how we looked at Rwanda as well as in Bosnia, and thus the sort of creation of norms like responsibility to protect. So with regard to the question on whether Holocaust literature helps us in understanding human rights better or do our work better on atrocity prevention, I would say the answer is a resounding yes. So in the context of the policy world, the insights we have gained on understanding Holocaust and in genocide literature in general, we've been able to do a better job in understanding risk factors, indicators that lead to the commission of atrocities. When you study the Holocaust, you understand what kinds of factors were created in society which enabled the Nazi abuse. How do we sort of think about justice and accountability? How do we think about reconciliation? How do we think about memorialization? A lot of that knowledge, a lot of that understanding has come from understanding the Holocaust. So in that sense, you know, we are all indebted to the work that genocide scholars, Holocaust scholars have done over the last 60, 70 years in understanding how we prevent and stop atrocities in the future. Also, the other point I want to bring in, and which is a very important point, and then Zoe sort of, you know, talked about it a little bit, is sort of the role of a different kind of literature, which is the literature on see again, that I start forgetting English. The whole idea of sort of testimonials and the testimonials that emerged from Holocaust, and I think that that's one genocide in which we have seen so much memorialization and the testimonials, which have not only sort of help us understand what victims and survivors and families and people with generational trauma go through, it has also shaped how we interact with victims and survivors of the current genocides and current atrocities. And it has also created sort of, because it's the human element of it, it has also created sort of, a global community, because there's so many similarities of experiences. Yes, the voices are very particular, the voices are context specific, but there is so many similarities in terms of how genocides are committed, how atrocities are committed, what comes after and what comes before. So I think that, the sort of short answer is that reading Holocaust and reading genocide literature has really helped us. And I think the continuing investment in understanding these past atrocities is particularly important at this point, when we are seeing more and more erasure of history, where we are seeing sort of alternative facts emerge, where we are seeing sort of book bannings and resistance to inclusion of certain kind of narratives within school syllabus. So it's important to sort of remember where we come from, and the Holocaust and the genocide literature helps us do that. To be very honest, as a practitioner, do I read this literature on a daily basis? Not really, but its existence, its narratives inform us. And I think that, I'm so looking forward to looking more at Zoe's work and the work that she's doing with all of these different Rwandan authors and poets, to sort of inform us and give us that individual experience that helps us then convince governments that it's not just about one space, or it's not just about history, as Alice said. It's something which is happening all the time, everywhere. And what the Holocaust teaches us, like it happened in the heart of Europe, that no society is immune. And because no society is immune, we all have to work towards creating systems, creating institutions that help us be better advocates for the past, but better practitioners for the future. So thank you so much, and I think I kept time.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Professor Tabea Lienhardt. She's Professor of Spanish and Global Studies and Comparative Literature at Washington University in St. Louis. Her research focuses on displacement and asylum in the 1930s and 1940s, and she has published extensively on migration and refugee studies, Spanish and Mexican literature, and film, memory studies, Jewish studies, and Mediterranean studies. She's a founding member of the Genealogies of Sfarad Research Collective, a principal investigator for the Moving Stories Research Initiative, and a member of the board of directors of the MICA, Migrant and Immigrant Community Action Project in St. Louis. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. It's an absolute honor to be here with all of you, and my first response to our question today is going to echo what you already said. Yes. And I'm done. No, I'm not done yet. I have more things to say. So we all know that reading literature, Holocaust literature, but also literature in general, fosters our sense of empathy. Literature can take us to extreme experiences, to the minds of deeply flawed individuals who make decisions in the most difficult and in the most darkest of times. Literature allows us to ask ourselves questions that we never dared to ask. But that also does not mean that reading literature or Holocaust literature immediately makes us better people. I mean, that would be nice, but it doesn't work that way. So if it's true that literature fosters our sense of empathy, that's also not good enough, I would say. There is a lot of literature, Holocaust literature and otherwise. Many people are reading literature and teaching literature, but human rights abuses have, of course, not stopped. To quote the scholar Lindsay Stonebridge and her book Writing and Writing, the problem is that for all the reading and all the feeling, the dumping on the powerless by the powerful has continued. Just lately, many would say, oppression has gotten a good deal less shameless, end of quote. So empathy then is not enough. And I think if we just think about empathy, we may run the risk of becoming complacent. So I want to think about some instances, very specific instances, where literature could strengthen human rights. And maybe there's something beyond empathy that we need to think about. So I'm going to give you just one specific example. And Daniel, there in the back, could you put up the image I asked for? There it is. Thank you very much. So this is a very early example. It comes from something we would call today a graphic narrative or a graphic novel. It's really a series of lino cuts that the Swiss-born artist Clement Moreau produced while he was already displaced in Argentina in the 1930s. So he was forced to leave Nazi Germany, settles in Argentina, and comes up with these series of lino cuts. The ones that you see on the image here belong to a text called Night Over Germany, which was translated as La Commedia Humana. And kind of at the very end of this graphic narrative, you see these two images. Actually, one is from the beginning. You see the man climbing over this barbed wire fence, and the barbed, going through skin and flesh right here. He was forced to flee his country. He had to escape. He had to cross borders. And at the end, the same character ends up in a new country that's not exactly a place that's hospitable to him. So we see this last image here where he looks dehumanized, even monstrous. And the caption says, "No longer human, stateless." And again, this is from the late 1930s, which means that Moreau's lino cuts precedes Hannah Arendt's famous formulation about the right to have rights. And of course, Hannah Arendt in 1948 was writing about that in order to get access to human rights, one needs to belong to an organized community. So being stateless, and we see this on the image right here, also means being rightless. So what can literature do about all of this? I would say that literature is the most powerful when it breaks things down in unexpected ways. When we read the world, we read it through genres. So we read a novel and we expect characters and the narrative arc. And when we go to a museum, we look for some kind of a frame and we expect an explanation of the artist and the medium and their context. But what if we read a novel and then there are no characters or there is no narrative? What if time and place break down? When language fails in such a way that we have to start from scratch and invent new languages. And this is where literature comes in again. And here I'm going to quote Lindsay Stonebridge again. "These kinds of writers are necessary to human rights, not simply because they urge moral compassion, but because they create imaginative terms by which it is possible to see injustice, not simply regret it, but to comprehend it." So maybe Holocaust literature by itself may not strengthen human rights, but it's going to help us to recognize how and when things fall apart and how we can rebuild and reimagine. And in my last minute or so, I want to speak briefly about dignity. So dignity is not something that we can eat or that we can use in exchange for something else that we can barter. Dignity will not allow you to cross borders safely or to prevent somebody from drowning. But what literature can do, Holocaust literature and otherwise, is to make us think of the dignity of those who need to barter to eat, who have no choice but to climb barbed wire fences and trust their lives and their children's lives to someone driving a truck or ferrying a makeshift boat across a river or an ocean. I had a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, but I will skip it, but simply leave you with the thought that Holocaust literature can take us to those places, especially when we think, and this is from Eleanor Roosevelt, about equal dignity without discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jean Damascene Gassanabo. He is consultant, former Director General of the Research and Documentation Center on Genocide, the Rwanda National Commission for the Fight Against Genocide. With a PhD in education from the University of Geneva, Dr. Gassanabo has experience working with the United Nations, international non-governmental organizations, non-profit organizations, and governments on projects related to atrocity crimes and equitable and sustainable education curricula. He served as consultant for the United Nations Office of the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide and consultant for UNESCO headquarters in Paris and in Somalia. He also headed the support department in charge of research and communications at Geneva Call, a Geneva-based NGO, as the Director General of the Research and Documentation Center on Genocide at the Rwanda National Commission for the Fight Against Genocide, CNLG. He managed and led research projects as well as designed, implemented, monitored, and assessed projects related to the genocide against the Tutsi. Key projects included the digitization of 45 million pages and 4,000 audiovisual materials from Rwanda's Gacaca courts, the preservation of textiles at the Nyamata Genocide Memorial Site, the preservation of bodies at the Murambi Genocide Memorial Site, and the preservation of artifacts in 6 other national genocide memorial sites in Rwanda. Between 2013 and 2015, he participated in a team responsible for designing Rwanda's new national education curriculum for history and civic education. He's currently consultant with international organizations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please allow me to take you back to Rwanda before discussing about the literature on the genocide. At the ratification and accession of to the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide on the 16th of April, 1975, Rwanda refused to recognize Article number 9 of the Convention. The Article number 9 of the Convention reads, I quote, disputes between the contracting parties relating to the interpretation, application, or fulfillment of the present Convention, including those relating to the responsibility of a state for genocide or for any of the other acts enumerated in Article number 3, shall be submitted to the International Court of Justice at the request of any of the parties to the dispute. And Article number 3 reads, I quote, the following acts should be punishable: genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, attempt to commit genocide, complicity in genocide. And the government of Rwanda refused the Article number 9. We are in 75. The communication of Rwanda at that time to the UN read, I quote, the Rwandese Republic doesn't consider itself as bound by the Article number 9 of the Convention, 16 April 1975. President Habyarimana, who has been Chief of Staff and Minister of Defense in Rwanda until when he made the coup in 1973, was aware of the killing of Tutsi in 59, in 60, 62, 63, 64, and 73. He was probably afraid of being accused of genocide in the future. He was probably thinking that a group of the population would be victims of genocide in the future, and he would be accused for being responsible. The post-genocide government decided to withdraw the reservation relating to the Article number 9, made upon accession to the convention. Rwanda sent a communication to the UN Secretary General on 15 December 2008, to withdraw the reservation. Now, let's talk about the teaching of history between the independence 1962 and the genocide 1994. When I was at school, because I went to school in Rwanda, in primary and high school, secondary school, I never learned about the Holocaust. I learned about the history of Second World War, yes, but what? About the battles, about who the general was leading a group of soldiers, in which city they were fighting, but nothing on the Holocaust. Because for me, the Holocaust is still the suffering of people, the pain of people. We never learned that. I never heard about that, or the Holocaust, just the war. And if we try to understand now the history of Rwanda, which was taught that time, if I take the Rogers Hermans, it's one of the textbooks, it's read, the arrival of the Tutsi was more by an infiltration than a conquest. What that means? This is one of the textbooks in Rwanda. And it says that, in fact, the Tutsis are not Rwandans because they came from outside. The arrival of Tutsi, so they came by infiltration. Paternoster de la Mérieux wrote in his book, which was one of the textbooks, Tutsis were foreigners. Dolakje, in his book, which became a textbook, he said, Tutsis were invaders, and foreigners. Fidel Nkundabagenzi, in his book, our struggle is an anti-colonialist struggle. Tutsi feudalism in Rwanda is a colonialism, which arises in the same terms and which requires the same solutions as European colonialism. The introduction of the terms Hamid and Bantu, implying in this context foreigners and natives, so meaning Tutsi are foreigners and Hutus are natives, was the basis of a divided and hierarchical society. In his speech of November 22nd, 1992, in Kabaya, in Rwanda, Lewo Mugesera, who was the vice president of the political party by Habyarimana, he said, I recently said to someone who was boasting about being in the Liberal Party, which was one of the political parties in Rwanda, he said, the mistake we made in 1959, even though I was a child then, was that we let you leave. I asked him if he hadn't heard the story of the Falasha who returned to their home in Israel from Ethiopia. And he said he didn't know this history. And I said to him, don't you know how to listen or read? Let me tell you that your home is in Ethiopia and that we will send you back along the Nyabarongo River so you get there quickly. We are 1992, 2 years before the genocide. In short, the pre-genocide curriculum emphasized more on exclusion of a group of Rwandans population. At school, we learned that Tutsi were foreigners, not Rwandans. What's the context in the post-genocide? Teaching about the genocide started in 1998, 3 years after the genocide. And the curriculum was revised in 2000, then also 2001, 2003, 2008, 2010, and then the last revision was 2015. And the new textbooks were available to the student in January 2016. And I was part of the team designing this new curriculum. So in this new curriculum, it's about also not only teaching about the genocide against Tutsi, but also teaching about the Holocaust, the Srebrenica, the Armenian genocide, and the Cambodian genocide. Because it's so important for Rwandan students to also learn about other genocide and Holocaust. And I want to quote the Rwanda Education Board here. The Rwanda Education Board, which is a government institutions in charge of education, they said, I quote, Rwandan's children should know about the genocide perpetrated against the Tutsi alongside the Holocaust and other genocides. Similarities and the differences between the 1994 genocide against Tutsi, the Holocaust, and other genocide will be discussed in grade 4 of the secondary school, or S4 in Rwanda, or grade 10 in New York, if you are familiar. So in New York, it's grade 10. Already in 2000, the National Curriculum Development Center stated that the change in the new curriculum was in line of promoting the values of peace and unity, specifically in the struggle for the respect of human rights and human dignity. So the teaching of history, together with what we call the citizenship education, it's about the genocide, the Holocaust, but also human rights and dignity, because we have to focus also on the values of human beings. We are all human beings, and Rwandan students should know that. As genocide and the Holocaust are cross-cutting issues, they are along taught in literature and language classes. Teachers use the content and knowledge of the genocide against the Tutsi and the Holocaust to encourage appropriate learning. Teachers could then initiate discussions on the youth engagement in preventing violence and promoting human rights. Aegis Trust in Rwanda, which is a British NGO, but with headquarters in Rwanda. Aegis Trust is helping the government of Rwanda, the Ministry of Education, Rwanda Education Board, to teach about Holocaust and genocide. And they have introduced what they called the Eyewitness Program from the University of Southern California. So they went to Rwanda to train Rwandans on how to use testimonies, because we have so many testimonies in Rwanda, especially at the Kigali Genocide Memorial. We have so many testimonies, and we need to know those testimonies, and we need to share those testimonies with the young people, because it's from there when they can learn. And because those Rwandans who were there in 1994 and who can talk to the young people are those who know the history and who can share the history and the history of Rwanda. I think I should stop here, so probably we'll have time to discuss more. Thank you.
Thank you. Last but not least, it's a pleasure to introduce Kirill Shields, the organizer of this wonderful event. He is Director of Education and Regional Policy at the Asia Pacific Center for the Responsibility to Protect. He's the current editor-in-chief of the international journal Genocide Studies and Prevention, and he writes on topics that include foreign affairs and regional politics. Working with organizations in the Southeast Asian region, he leads the center's training on the prevention of hate speech and disinformation, and he lectures at the University of Queensland on topics such as literature, the Holocaust, the history of genocide, world affairs and politics, and humanitarianism.
Thank you, Daniel. As Daniel sort of noted in that introduction, I'm very fortunate where I sort of bridge two worlds. On the one hand, I teach and I lecture and research at a university. And on the other hand, I work for a center, an atrocity prevention center institute that encourages or hopes to encourage atrocity prevention through networks and projects with regional civil society, with NGOs, think tanks, other outlets across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. So I spruik my world as one that bridges the theoretical and the practical But though where I often find that my knowledge base, that scholarship, is undermined or readjusted through the work of human rights practitioners who are on the ground and far more aware of cultural, societal, political nuance that dictate and sort of mould decisions. And as an example of that, some years ago when I first started at the centre, I went to Indonesia to teach on atrocity prevention. I'd put together this curriculum, 2 days of atrocity prevention for Indonesian officials. I turned up and my good friend and colleague who works in a well-regarded think tank said, "So Kirill, in this 2-day workshop, you're not going to mention R2P, are you?" I said, okay. I take out slide number 3 and slide number 4. And then she said, and of course, don't mention genocide, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing or war crimes, and especially not in a regional context, which this meant I had to rewrite my entire lecture slides. And so I've learnt a lot over the last few years. From that I've gained a lot of information, a lot of insight into what to say and what not to say in regards to genocide and atrocity prevention. But this is one aspect of it where I walk away surprised. In another vein, but in a slightly different setting, I'm always surprised when my international students as well give me a different perspective. When I teach students from countries such as China or Indonesia who enroll in my History of Genocide course, and only to find that they have little to no knowledge of their own past and the atrocities committed in their own countries, but also have never heard of the Holocaust. Or if they have done so, it's very peripheral and sometimes via kind of problematic understandings of this past. So what I don't want to do here is I don't wish to judge those students or colleagues or wherever it is in the region for not having insight into this history, as there are numerous considerations and complications that mean that this European history is not part of their education, nor part of their cultural or societal memory. Because if you are not going to talk about or educate on your own nation's difficult past, then you are most likely not going to talk about a past that's geographically, historically, spiritually, or culturally removed from yours. And yet, what happens as I sort of work between these two sectors, watching my students from the region come to an understanding of Holocaust, plus also seeing how my colleagues at civil society levels work within the region, I sort of ponder two overarching questions in relation to today's topic. One is, for those who work as humanitarians in various capacities in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, what would an understanding of the Holocaust bring to their own approaches of their work? And the second question is, well, how might knowing about this past help them bring in an awareness or a means of restitution or understanding to their own nation's history? And for example, if you don't know this, in 1965 and 66, Indonesian government at the time massacred nearly 1 million Indonesian, in inverted commas, communists in roughly 6 to 8 months. And this is something rarely discussed, very much hidden societally, and until actually only recently under the soon-to-be past president, under his admission of past mass human rights violations, this event was very much a taboo topic in forums and in sectors across the country. So might Holocaust literature provide a pathway to show you how to learn about brutal pasts and act as something like a restorative process, part of a nation's, maybe a transitional justice process? And the answer is obviously probably yes. But in a second I'll talk a little bit more on that. Even a small amount of knowledge taken from narratives about the Holocaust should surely eventuate, for example, with a person gaining insight into populations and individuals at both their worst and also, importantly, at the most resistant and the most resilient. So it's important to bring knowledge that there are those who have committed vile crimes, but there are also those who have been victimized and who have suffered, and those who are fortunate to have survived. Because this story and its formula, that story of perpetration and victimization, as we've seen from colleagues today, is not unique. And as many examples in our region, including the massacres in Indonesia, speak to, because those who perpetrated those crimes still walk free, and those who were victimized remain traumatized, and until recently, there was very little recourse to reparation. So as I have found with my students, and when talking on the topic with persons who work on the ground in the region, either in conversation or as part of the training we do as a centre, the Holocaust and its literature can actually be a key instrument, and I know it's a blunt term to use, but a key instrument in helping those who work in the humanitarian sector negotiate their past so as to make sense of their present. And this is a seemingly probably obvious but an often overlooked aspect of working in the sector that is dealing in our region with bloodshed and mass displacement on a daily basis. For example, how often might someone who works for a small NGO get either the inclination all the time to ponder a past and its effect on the present, given that this past is never talked about openly or honestly, and the relevance probably seems blurred or opaque to the work they're doing in camps or as advocates. So then stories about the Holocaust provide maybe examples and ways and means of helping them examine and explain their similar situations. And as an example of that, I won't talk on a lot of text, but just to illustrate my point, in Cambodia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines, young artists at the moment are replicating Maus as a means of trying to come to terms with the past. But there are complications. Europeans and their presence in Southeast Asia and the Pacific is still something being negotiated. In Southeast Asia, colonization, it saw Britain, Germany, Holland, Portugal, and France, and even Australia for a while, devour resources and create inequality, and in Australia's case, deny Indigenous communities a voice, spirituality, a language, a way of being, and more. And then there was a period of recolonization, including with the history of America in places like Vietnam. So for those who are well aware of colonial history and those who continue to suffer the aftermath, Holocaust literature is received probably, and I spoke on this week as part of the project, as another example of Western attempts at hegemonic racial politics, and that Europe, with its democratic allies such as the US, have something inherently wrong with them. And that's not to dismiss their own region's own bloodletting and massacres, as some of my students from China reveal, but they find reading Holocaust narratives a source of critique and an explanation of what colonization did and continues to do to their own country and the residual aftereffects of this European condition. So they ask, how is it that wherever you Europeans go, or akin to that, you cause large-scale upheaval and mass sorrow? And the corollary is obvious. That is, don't ask to repair our society and suggest we come to terms with our past, given that you created much of this mess. And second, you seem, according to what I've read about the Holocaust, not to have always dealt with this past as well as you could have. And just to finish, this is where reading the Holocaust narrative becomes a different and difficult proposition. And for practitioners in our region, this burden of colonization is something that is an ever-present reality. And makes me wonder if reading Holocaust literature might evolve akin to our Australian Indigenous authors, where they're taking up this position of reappropriating this corpus of literature and the knowledge that comes with it, but using this knowledge as possibly a cathartic form of expression that signals the frustration and disbelief of select Europeans and similar states and their ongoing interventions or their lack of intervention. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. So we have a few questions to talk amongst ourselves, and I thought maybe for the sake of time I consolidate them. And I want to ask, so given that we're all from different places in the world or study different places in the world, what are these governments, the respective governments, hoping for in embedding this literature in national curriculums? And conversely, is there a reason to teach about the Holocaust via Holocaust literature if one's country has their own genocidal past, be it in Rwanda or elsewhere? I'm opening this to the floor. I don't want to point to people, no. People should pick it up, thank you.
I can go first. You know, I come from, a point that I wanted to make in the presentation was also that, you know, many of us who do this work, many of the times, a lot of the people come because of past atrocities and not necessarily the classification of a genocide. So, I mean, coming from India, my father's family, we were displaced during the India-Pakistan partition. And, I mean, there are many, many horrifying stories and, you know, so coming from there, growing up, there were a lot of discussion, not sort of per se on human rights, because that language did not necessarily exist, but around justice and protection. And many colleagues that I meet from around the world, it's not per se genocide literature or a Holocaust literature, but you know, this work that we do and this sort of the fire within us to do this kind of work is very much inspired by what we have seen, what we have read, and testimonials. I mean, and I mentioned this in my presentation, but they have an incredible amount of impact. You know, I mean, I've been to different Showas, and I mean, and this museum is so fantastic in terms of sort of truly telling you the human cost of it. And from just having a policy discussion about it, it truly tells you like what is, how human or universal the stories are, the relationships are, and how they are impacted. So I think that it's not, I mean, for me, it's not so much about just reading the Holocaust, though it has had an immense amount of influence. I think that also, you know, Daniel, your own presentation about sort of the different phases and, you know, from Schindler's List to the sort of that opening up of, I mean, for many, many years, Holocaust was either denied or not in the mainstream. But when it came into the mainstream, its influence on popular culture has been, you know, so significant that no other sort of historical event or an event where populations were deliberately targeted has been talked about as much as the Holocaust. So I'll stop there. It's a long answer, but, you know, I think that I hope that I shed some light.
Yeah, I want to interject some provocative thing here, that is historical memory is obviously instrumental for this, but at the same time, I don't have to tell you, for instance, talk about partition, talk about current, how shall I say, people who abuse historical memory, because especially authoritarian governments have discovered historical memory as a very convenient tool. They have become Gramscians. They understand that this is cultural politics, this matters. So that complicates the picture a little bit. If you look at contemporary efforts, Carol, I think you wanted to say something.
I was just going to say that if you're talking on curriculum, sorry, I didn't. I mean, there's always an agenda behind it. And if you think about what the agenda is between, of course, the agenda within nations, but also within states in Australia's case. And each state in Australia has a different agenda as to why to teach on Holocaust. I mean, there's an overarching goal that maybe they learn something about a history, but I don't think it's connected to them becoming good citizens. I don't think the overarching goal of education and educating about Holocaust within Australia is to teach people to be good towards each other. I think it's more about setting it within the historical narrative, and then to show that, you know, that, and then what it does is ties it into another sort of historical narrative, which is ours. So there's always kind of an agenda to it. And unfortunately, I don't think it speaks to the topic, which is that, you know, if you learn about the Holocaust, you're going to become a good kid, you're going to become an empathetic kid. I don't think the agenda works like that within our sort of curriculum. So, and then the question would be, well, how do you then turn it around? And one of the ways they're doing that is, I noticed that they're taking and learning about specifics of things, not the Holocaust history as such, but then looking at thematics such as hate speech or bigotry, and talking about indifference, and that sort of stems out of Holocaust education, but becomes a little bit more, a little wider, a little bit more philosophic, which is an important discussion to have. That is only a recent phenomenon within the curriculums within our schools.
No, and, can I just add to the point that you raised? I mean, absolutely. I think that even in India right now, the way that literature, the memory of partition is being manipulated, it's about sort of, you know, turning a Hindu majority state and sort of just bringing in those sort of partisan conversations around Hindus and Muslims. And that's, I mean, even for me, it is interesting, given this government stance, that now for the first time, because you know, in countries like India, which were resource constrained, you know, once the partition happened, 10, 15 years, I mean, even then, there's not just sort of a huge amount of literature or a huge amount of sort of memorialization of it. It happened later, but it's still not something which is, you know, discussed in the mainstream. But now we have a museum, and for me, the reluctance to go to the museum is because it seems like a project of Hindu nationalism rather than a project which actually, you know, looks at the human cost.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think there is a difference between being in a divided society and being in a country where, this history never happened. I think the special advisor mentioned that some think that that's too far from us, and really, what are we talking about? But now, in the case of Rwanda, we had genocide against the Tutsi. That's the reality. And today, Rwandan teachers who either have family members in prisons because they killed Tutsis, or they have family members who are survivors. So imagine that teacher, in fact, how he's or she's going to talk about, to explain what's happened. And in his class, he has students, let's say 50, because you have so many kids in the class, 50 students, and some, when they are home, they ask, Mama, why I don't have grandpa? Why I don't have grandma? And the other one, his classmate has grandpa, probably, or everyone, or both sides. So now, the situation is so complex. And you have the content, which has been designed by the Ministry of Education or Rwanda Education Board to help those teachers and students to learn about what's happened, the history of the genocide. And the content is giving information, but is not giving everything. So there is that content, but how you explain the content when you know that, by the way, the reality is, and I think we had a conference in Kigali this April, and sometimes when you talk to teachers, they said, you know what? When I have to teach about the history of the genocide, and then there is a chapter on genocide, I skip the chapter because I don't know how to explain. I don't know how to talk about this. I don't know, it's so complex for me, it's so difficult for me. And then the question was, what do you do? Then the teacher said, I asked one of my colleagues to come to my class and teach this. So what that means, it means that we still have to teach ourselves. I don't know if it makes sense, but we as adults, we have first of all to understand the situation. We have to understand our situation. We have to make efforts to understand the reality we are living in. And it's something, it's in ourselves. When we are talking about those complex issues, we have to understand ourselves that they are complex, but we have to really accept that. So before we talk about that, so that's why in Rwanda, the teaching of history is together with teaching the citizenship education. How do you behave? Your behavior vis-a-vis to the kids, vis-a-vis to your colleagues, your family, your environment. So, it's 30 years. We still have a long way to go in terms of understanding, in terms of accepting, in terms of, and really face the reality as adults vis-a-vis to the kids we have, and in our family. So what we say to our kids in family, and what we say to the kids or the teacher say to the kids in class, it sometimes is different to the reality. So now, and I don't think this is only in Rwandan case. I think we are human beings, and we know that those are complex issues, difficult to accept. Because if in my village I have someone, in my village, my parents, my father is in prison, everybody knows. Everybody knows. So how am I going to talk about the genocide against the Tutsi if I'm a teacher, when I'm teaching kids from my village? So there is effort to make in ourselves, in myself, in yourself as a teacher. And then to be able to understand, first of all, to understand the reality, to accept the reality, and to open our mindset, to be, to be open. So it's opening our mindset, our being free in terms, I don't know if, being free, there is a reality, but should I accept? Yes, I have to accept the reality.
Please.
Thank you, Jean.
Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean Damascene. So I was going to say that I think possibly it's not a good idea to have these things on the national curriculum, but hearing you speak and hearing you talk about how you need to make the effort, actually I think maybe it is helpful to have it on the national curriculum because it gives people that push to make that effort, to grapple with things. I wanted to say that Holocaust literature in the UK is not on the national curriculum. Teaching the Holocaust is, but it's in the history curriculum. And I think that is interesting, and I wish that it was on the literature curriculum, but I also think that there's a need to put, in some ways I think it would be helpful to have it in conversation with other later genocides, the genocide in Srebrenica, Rwanda, the genocide against the Tutsi, Sudan, Darfur, and other emerging genocides today, because I think that that's extremely relevant for the students in the classroom to be talking about all of those experiences. At the same time, we're not doing anywhere near enough to think about colonial history and to think about the history of how we enslaved African people and forced them to work under terrible conditions on this side of the Atlantic, right? And this is a personal issue for me because my children are 8 and 9 and my husband is Jamaican. So my children grow up reading Holocaust literature, but they also grow up reading Caribbean literature and trying to understand some of what happened there in that very difficult, very dark history as well. And when I teach at the university, I find, as you were saying, how you bring your history into this work. At the university, in my classes, students come from all around the world with all of their histories, and they approach Holocaust literature and Rwandan literature with their families front and center, and with their own experiences and histories front and center. And a lot of them talk to me afterwards about how they then go away and talk to their grandparents, their parents, their aunts, their families about what happened during partition and so on. And so at its best, it can sort of open us up to have more of these conversations. But I remain on the fence about whether it should be legislated and written down that you have to teach it or don't. I think that's a very interesting and important conversation to have. I don't have any answers for it right now.
Ms. Norito?
Yeah, thank you. With some of our sister UN agencies, UNESCO, especially UNICEF, we've done huge amount of work in putting out Holocaust and genocide education in schools globally. A lot of it, of course, is subject to what the governments in those countries agree to. And what we find is that although there's lots and lots of there's information that can be put into curriculum, that young people or students also rely a lot on social media to pick up information, and that there's lots of debate on social media around curriculums. What should we be learning about the Holocaust and the genocide against the Tutsi or the genocide in Srebrenica? What should we be learning? And there is a lot of counterfacts. When you speak about Holocaust denial and genocide denial, it's an industry. It's a real industry. It's incredible. If you see the lengths the Holocaust deniers go to and genocide deniers, initially I used to find it so ridiculous. I used to think to myself, why would anybody do this? But if you look at their methods, then you see that their methods are very efficient and they are very organized. So that, like, for example, in Srebrenica, to counter the work of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the Republika Srpska actually organized for a commission of inquiry to which they invited the most prominent Holocaust deniers that they know to come and negate what the courts had proved and to say that the genocide did not happen. And they issued a report. There is an existing report. And if you look at them and the conferences that they held and the discussions they've been having, and the writing in their own peer-reviewed journals, so that when you, for example, Google, say, the Holocaust, then the information that you get is the information that the Holocaust did not happen. Then you see how concerted it is. Many of them are historians, unfortunately. Historians, they call themselves revisionists. Yeah, people who revise so that the proper history is written. And they are coming together as Holocaust deniers and genocide deniers in Srebrenica, actually inspired our producing this policy document that we produced on Holocaust and genocide denial, because our argument was, if they are coming together, why shouldn't we come together and counter them? So as we speak, we have arrangements with tech and social media companies so that, for example, based on their algorithms, based on an old conversation we've been having with them, and Security Council brief that I did in October 2021, and working with our UNESCO especially, with tech and social media companies, so that if you Google Holocaust denial or did the Holocaust not happen, like on all these social media spaces, especially Meta has been very good, like Facebook. And then what comes to you is huge amounts of information about how the Holocaust actually happened, how Srebrenica genocide happened, how the genocide against the Tutsi happened. If you are looking for denial information, then you get the opposite. Yeah, so I think in terms of thinking of education, beyond the traditional curriculum, I think we need to speak to all those other spaces where young people or even older people are engaged, and this is that space of social media. And then the curriculum developers, they always push back. I used to do a lot of work with them in Kenya, and they would say, people are always trying to put things in curriculum. So our natural response is always to push back until you like prove to us that it really needs to get into the curriculum. So we found that there are also huge potential in extracurricular activities. So in debates, you know, in drama festivals, you know, in music festivals, you know, in sports, you know, all those spaces, we found that there was huge amounts of information you can put out in that space. But in curriculums, I think the key test for us would be, so it is in the curriculum, but is it examinable? Because so long as it's not examinable, then everybody's just cramming their, you know, their geography and their mathematics and what they feel they have to sit an exam for. But if they're not going to sit an exam on the Holocaust, and then that becomes a problem. And then I think the final one, when I was working in Nigeria, we used to have lots of conversations. I used to mediate armed conflict in Nigeria, and lots of people would be talking about, I was here first, because there would be identity conflicts. And I remember one day saying, okay, you say you were here first, somebody else says they were here first. Let's look at your history books. Like, what are they teaching in school about who was here first? Only to learn that they don't teach that they got it out of the curriculum, that it's not there because it's too divisive. So then I began looking in terms of which countries are not teaching history and why are they not teaching it? And so then that's another whole dynamic, because there are countries that are deliberately not teaching history. And then, of course, there are countries that are teaching history but teaching their own kind of history, what they want to be taught. And I think Bosnia-Herzegovina becomes, I think, classic example, you know, about the what they call the two schools under one roof, where the children will walk in together and then they'll separate. And then like the Croat children will be taught by the Croat teachers, the sub children will be taught by sub teachers. And of course you go home to your sub parents or your Croat parents. And at the end of the day, and I'm talking about all the constituent peoples of Bosnia and Herzegovina, at the end of the day, your ecosystem is defined by just your ethnic group. So if you open a textbook, and I can tell you we've looked at that, and it's so fascinating to see children in one school whose history, the history they are learning, the geography they are learning, the mathematics they are learning is completely different. The mathematics has very specific Croat examples, and there is influence, of course, from the countries in the region, Croatia, Serbia. It's just so amazing. So when you think about how Holocaust history is taught, it's also taught from the perspective of who was on which side during the Second World War, who was with the Nazis, who was not with the Nazis, and that's how it's taught. So there's a whole world of thinking that we need to be looking at in terms of if you're looking at Holocaust education today in different parts of the world, which it needs to be. What do we need to unpack about all these dynamics that are out there? And I think for me the final one would be language. For many countries, the first language of instruction is in the, what you call the mother tongue or the first language. And how then do you translate Holocaust education into languages, as many languages as possible? And I think a good example would be how, for example, Christian religious education is taught in Africa. The Bible, I think, is the most translated book in the world. It's virtually, you can find a Bible in virtually every language in the world. And we do need to have a project beyond Holocaust education, even for human rights education, that speaks to translating into local language and speaking through local language mediums, especially vernacular radio stations, spaces where people feel comfortable about these kind of things. So thank you.
Thank you. You actually preempted. Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry, Daniel. I think I've got the nod from Sydney that we are over time. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So maybe just, Tabia, do you want to add one comment to that? And then if you don't have to.
Very briefly. So we talked about reading, and then we switched to teaching, and those are very, very related, of course. I mean, we all, we learn to read in school, and what you mentioned about, your experience in school, I thought that was very moving and very important. But reading is this lifelong thing. Education is too, right? But I'm assuming that we're all kind of lifelong readers, and I think one of the reasons why we may be sitting here on the stage today is that we've had good teachers who taught us to be subversive, unruly readers, and I think that's always the other part. So, we are teaching, books being published, but we also have to think about how do we read these texts and how can we become these subversive, unruly readers that can then lead to a positive answer to our question today.
Well, maybe I'll just wrap up. So I know we're over time. Thank you very, very much for being here. My thanks goes to Daniel for chairing. Thank you very much for the panel, Alice, Zoe, Savita, Tabia, and Jean Domacen. Did I say that correctly? Kind of, yeah. Thank you very much. I know that you all have busy schedules. I also like to thank once again the Museum of Jewish Heritage for hosting us. And just a final round of applause, if you don't mind, to the panelists who are here today. Thank you.